All right, I'll get started now. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Michelle Craddock, and I am the Natural Resource Damages Program Coordinator at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. I am joined by Whitney Behr, who also works in the Natural Resource Damages Program for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of the Northeast Field Office. We're here tonight to talk about the restoration planning process associated with the Ocean King Great Harbor fuel spill and the natural resource damages settlement associated with that. I have about 25 slides that I'm going to go through tonight. I'll talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers after that. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and I'll answer them at the end. Also, just to let you know, this presentation is being recorded, and it'll be posted to MassDEP's website in the next day or two. So I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background on what exactly natural resource damages are. So there are several federal and state laws that govern cleanup when there is a release of hazardous materials or oil into the environment. Those include laws like CERCLA or the Superfund Act, OPA, also known as the Oil Pollution Act, as well as Chapter 21E in Massachusetts. Those laws, along with some additional laws, authorize natural resource trustees to recover monetary damages when there is a release of oil or other hazardous materials to compensate the public for any injuries to natural resources. So, as you can imagine, when there's an oil spill or another kind of type of contaminant release into the environment, both cleanup occurs as well as natural resource damage assessment and restoration. So the cleanup, is pretty well known to people. Typically, it's focused on assessing the contamination that's occurred, working to control the source of that contamination and clean it up. There's a focus on reducing risk to human health and the environment. Natural resource damage assessment and restoration is kind of a separate process that usually occurs a little bit after the cleanup has occurred, but utilizes data that's typically collected as part of the cleanup. And so this process is used to determine whether public natural resources have been injured, destroyed, or lost as a result of a release of hazardous material or oil into the environment. So we and the Natural Resource Damage Program are really focused on assessing the extent, whether that's the aerial extent and the duration of the injury to natural resources. We're then able to kind of quantify what that injury is and determine a monetary value that's needed to restore those injured natural resources. We would then typically negotiate the monetary damages with the party that's responsible for the contamination, and then collect that money from them. Natural resource damage assessment and restoration would then use those collected monetary damages to implement restoration projects that would benefit the injured natural resource and essentially compensate the public for the losses. So a couple kind of important aspects of natural resource damages settlements. So the funds that we receive, they can't be used to fund required cleanup activities. So these funds are really intended to go above and beyond what's required as part of the cleanup and to compensate the public by restoring these injured natural resources. So I just wanted to give kind of a quick example of natural resource damage assessment and restoration. So I'm going to just talk briefly about the Bouchard oil spill, which some of you on the phone might be familiar with. So this was a really large oil spill of 98,000 gallons that happened in Buzzards Bay back in 2003. There was a large natural resource damages settlement associated with that, just under $20 million. As you know or can imagine, there were a variety of injuries associated with that spill. There were impacts to biota, injury to birds, to island habitat, lots of things. But for the purposes of this example, I'm going to highlight the injury to intertidal habitat in public use that was caused by the oiling of the shoreline in Buzzards Bay. So based on that injury, we implemented a wide variety of restoration projects to attempt to restore that injured natural resource. So we implemented things like habitat restoration projects via dam removal that improved habitat for migratory fish that also used intertidal habitat, as well as water quality. We provided funding towards shoreline land acquisition and protection that allowed for enhanced public use, as well as benefited bird nesting habitat. And additionally, we provided funding to some communities to purchase equipment that would enhance the public access. So you can see a picture on the screen there of one of the Moby mats that was purchased to improve public use to the shoreline. And so the kind of important thing about this slide is it's really demonstrating that there needs to be a close nexus between the injured natural resources and the restoration projects that are implemented. And that's kind of a central theme of natural resource damages. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later when we get to talking about the injuries associated with the Ocean King fuel release. Stepping back a bit, since 1992, the Commonwealth has settled over 20 natural resource damages claims worth over $80 million. As you can see, the amounts, kind of vary greatly based on kind of the type of contamination, the duration, and the extent. So spills like the Bouchard B120 oil spill, we got just under $20 million in settlement funds. New Bedford Harbor, obviously, there was a lot of contamination there. We also had a similarly large settlement, but then we also have a lot of kind of smaller settlements. Ocean King isn't the smallest, it's just the smallest one I included on this slide. But we received a $100,000 cash out settlement for the Ocean King fuel release. That said, we were able to secure some additional funds for restoration from the United States Department of the Interior. So we actually have $370,000 available for restoration projects associated with this case. So we've been talking a lot about natural resource injury, natural resource restoration. What exactly are these natural resources that we're talking about? Natural resources that we're talking about here include any resources belonging to or managed by federal, state, or local governments, as well as tribes. So that can include things like biota, like amphibians, fish, bird species, other wildlife species, as well as their habitats. It can include both soil and sediment, groundwater and surface water, as well as air. And typically when there is a spill or release of oil or other hazardous materials, multiple natural resources or resource services are injured. So you can imagine if there's a spill into the surface water, that surface water might be injured. The biota that's feeding or living in the surface water might be injured. If that contaminant sinks to the bottom, the sediment might be injured. In addition to natural resource injuries, we're also looking at injuries to natural resource services. Those are the services that a natural resource might provide. So things like fishing, hunting, recreational shell fishing, medicinal resources, things like water and air purification or pest and disease control, stormwater retention, floodplain capacity, carbon sequestration, recreational use, as well as spiritual and cultural use. So these are all things we're taking into consideration when we're conducting those assessments associated with spills. Federal, state, and tribal governments, as I said before, are authorized to act on behalf of the public as trustees of natural resources and to conduct this natural resource damage assessment and restoration process through those laws that I mentioned earlier. For this site, there are two natural resource trustees. First is the U.S. Department of the Interior, represented by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The second is the Massachusetts Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, represented by MassDEP. Um, the actual natural resource trustees for these agencies are obviously not on this meeting. They typically delegate natural resource trustee representatives to represent them in these cases and in these meetings. So that's what what Whitney and I are serving on their behalf tonight. So now we're going to get kind of into the spills and the injury associated with it. So why did the natural resource trustees decide to pursue a claim for this spill? So, as I'm sure probably most of you on this call are at least somewhat familiar, but back in January of 2018, there was an oil release from the Ocean King vessel into Great Harbor in Woods Hole. There was early on an oil sheen that was reported by a local citizen. And then MassDEP came on to site and observed black oil coating pilings, rocks, and the shoreline habitat in the vicinity of the dock where the Ocean King was tied up. Additionally, a large portion of Great Harbor was covered with an oil sheen. Kind of after that was observed, a response action was implemented that lasted, I believe, about 5 days and included the deployment of containment booms, absorbent materials. There was actually some oil and oil impacted debris that was removed directly from the shoreline around the Great Harbor. And additionally, there was recovery of oiled wildlife, primarily birds. So the release, injured kind of a variety of natural resources. The primary injury was to migratory birds. As I mentioned, there were, I think, about 29 bird carcasses, oiled bird carcasses that were recovered from the site or in close proximity to the site. Those included birds like common eider, scoter, and long-tailed duck. There also were some injuries to the shoreline, as I'd mentioned before. There was oil accumulated on that, as well as to recreational shellfishing within Great Harbor. So the recreational shellfish beds there were closed kind of immediately upon discovery of the oil release. And they didn't open until, I think, September 15th, 2018, although some of that period they were closed anyways. But there was a time period where the shellfish beds were closed due to this oil release. So, one more thing I just wanted to mention quickly before I move on is that, there was this natural resource damages settlement here. But in addition, Patriot Marine, who owned the vessel, also paid an administrative consent order with penalty to MassDEP for just under, for about $48,000. And this was for failure to report the release to MassDEP, failure to take response actions, as well as discharge of the actual pollutants. So there was this kind of administrative consent order, as well as the NRD settlement. And on top of that, there was, at the same time our negotiations were happening for the NRD settlement, the U.S. Coast Guard was negotiating to recoup their costs associated with the cleanup as well. So just to quickly talk about how we assessed damages here, I kind of mentioned on the previous slide what the injuries were that we were looking at, the injuries to migratory birds, recreational shellfishing, and shoreline habitat. We used a lot of the data that was collected as part of the cleanup to be able to kind of quantify the extent of the injuries over both space and time. So kind of, aerial extent of oiling in the harbor, the time it was there for, using data like that. We then estimated how much it would cost to restore the injured natural resources. So, the cost to restore the shellfishing, cost to restore the shoreline, and the migratory birds. We then developed the claim and negotiated with the responsible parties and reached a settlement in May of 2024. As I said earlier, that resulted in a $100,000 cash out settlement to be used towards natural resource restoration. But again, we did secure additional funds, so that amount is more like $370,000. So next steps. So the settlement has been finalized. We have the money in our Natural Resource Damages Trust account. Now what? So now kind of comes, the fun part. We get to work with, you guys, the stakeholders, and the public to help write a restoration plan that will restore, replace, or acquire the equivalent of those injured natural resources. So the restoration plan is, a formal document that we prepare for all natural resource damages cases, and it will kind of evaluate a range of different restoration projects and assess them based on the ecological, socioeconomic, cultural, and historic benefits and effects of those projects. So before we talk about kind of how we're going to find these projects, I thought it'd be helpful to talk about what types of projects might qualify here. So, again, we're seeking projects that benefit migratory birds, coastal habitat or shoreline habitat, as well as recreational shellfishing. So there's a wide variety of project types that might benefit those resources. So some examples are here on the slide. Wetland and salt marsh restoration projects would potentially qualify for this. So projects that would restore wetland hydrology by doing things like removing historic fill from the marsh surface, or replacing undersized culverts to allow a more natural tidal regime into the salt marsh could be good candidates for this funding. Additionally, projects that remove invasive species and restore native plants within wetlands and salt marshes would also qualify. Coastal land protections, another project type that would qualify for this funding, as well as eelgrass and shellfish restoration, really any project that would improve coastal water quality and reduce stormwater runoff, as well as potentially marine debris cleanup projects. And so these are all project types that we think would benefit the injured natural resources. They're all project types that we've funded using other settlement funds. I think, the Bouchard funds probably funded projects in all of these categories. I know we had a really interesting project that we funded through the Buzzards Bay Coalition, where they installed some conservation boat moorings to benefit eelgrass in West Falmouth Harbor. We've definitely put money towards coastal land protection on Cuttyhunk and other locations. And we just recently funded a marine debris cleanup actually in Boston Harbor to benefit common eider. So all of these kind of project types would qualify here. Additionally, species-specific restoration projects that target the impacted or injured species would qualify. So projects that increase productivity or enhance migratory bird and shellfish habitat would qualify. Again, some of the injured birds here included common eider, white-winged scoter, and long-tailed duck. So there are kind of some specific types of projects that don't qualify for natural resource damages funding. And this is, kind of standard criteria that we use in our cases and that's spelled out in the regulations. So any activities that are otherwise required by law or permit, things like cleaning up a contaminated site, a wetland mitigation project, or required stormwater improvements wouldn't qualify for this funding. Additionally, I kind of stress the importance of a nexus to the injured natural resources. So projects that don't restore same or similar resources also wouldn't qualify. So projects like constructing a playground or a community garden or implementing a recycling program, while they're great projects, they wouldn't qualify for this kind of funding. So how are we going to find these projects. How are we going to generate these ideas? So we're kind of kicking that off tonight with this public meeting, but we're really looking for input from the public and other stakeholders throughout this process. So we are going to release tomorrow morning a project information form that will be available for folks to submit project ideas to us through kind of a formal process that will later be evaluated on to whether it will be included in the restoration plan. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but we'll also be kind of conducting outreach to the local communities as well as outreach to government agencies and non-governmental organizations that might have potential projects in the vicinity that benefit those injured natural resources. So a little bit more on how to submit a project idea. So I mentioned this project information form. It's a fillable PDF form that's kind of a standard form that we use to solicit natural resource damage project ideas. The project will get emailed directly to Whitney with her contact infos directly within the sheet. And the form's really just to gather ideas and, doesn't constitute a formal proposal for funding. So it's not a pre-proposal, it's not a proposal. It's really just kind of a form that's intended to be relatively quick and easy to fill out. And we'll gather kind of a lot of pertinent information about these potential projects, but also not take too much of your time. So there's a variety of fields in here, kind of ranging from entering general information about your organization and your contact info, some spaces to put, project information, including the project name, the location, and the size of the project. That big box there is kind of for the project description, where it's intended for you to outline kind of project objectives, the activities to be completed, outcomes, anticipated benefits to people in the environment, things like that. And there's kind of a variety of check boxes where you can click off the project activities to be implemented, the types of habitats to benefit, the resources that will benefit. And then finally, towards the end, we get into asking about the project status. Is it just an idea in your head? Is it in conceptual design? Is it gone through permitting, is just looking for funding? Things like that we'd want to understand, as well as project cost and any additional project partners. So like I said, this is a pretty, quick and easy thing to complete. You're more than welcome to submit more than one project idea. If there's additional information that you want to include with it, like reports or plans or photos, you can feel free to attach those to the email when you send it in to Whitney. So once we have all of those project information forms submitted to us, we will go through an evaluation process that's pretty detailed and comprehensive, we think. And it utilizes guidance and criteria from those NRD regulations and that we've used in many other cases. And those will help us really evaluate and prioritize projects to go into the restoration plan. So some of the evaluation criteria that we'll be using are these kind of listed on the screen. So, I've mentioned the first couple a few times during this presentation, but we will be having a look at how physically close the project is to the injured site. There is definitely a preference for the restoration to occur in close proximity to where the injury occurred. It's not always possible to do that where the actual injury was, but we do look at how close it is. I will say we definitely have a preference, I think, for projects in the Falmouth area or the Woods Hole area, but we'll consider projects in other towns with a nexus to the injured natural resources, if it makes sense. We'll also be looking at the extent to which the project restores resources that were harmed. So I've talked a lot about that, but when we're looking at that, we'll be making sure that this project is benefiting all those injured natural resources. We'll also be looking at whether the project's feasible. Could it get permitted? We really want to provide funding towards projects that we think are going to get towards construction or get towards, you know, a finalized land purchase and protection. So that's something we evaluate as well. But looking at the cost effectiveness of the project in terms of, you know, the ecological benefit we're getting for the cost. We'll be looking for the likelihood of success, whether there could be any negative effects associated with the project, as well as whether more than one natural resource could benefit. So again, you know, after we've kind of gone through that evaluation process, we will write up this restoration plan that will present and evaluate several restoration project scenarios. We'll typically identify the preferred scenario. There might be kind of like a primary restoration scenario and then a secondary one if additional funding becomes available, or if one of those primary restoration projects doesn't work out, we might fund. Once we have that draft restoration plan put together, we would hold a public meeting and solicit public comment through a, you know, a formal comment period process. This is the estimated timeline we've put together for releasing the final restoration plan. So tonight we're kicking it off with this public meeting. Project information sheets will be released tomorrow. Just as an aside, Whitney will be sending out an email first thing in the morning, kind of describing the process with the forms attached. If for some reason you haven't been getting emails from Whitney, feel free to put your contact info in the chat and we'll make sure you get added to that. We'll also be posting the project information form to MassDEP's website in the next day or two. Those forms are due back to Whitney by January 13th, 2025. We'll then be spending the winter and spring of 2025 evaluating the restoration projects. We might, you know, follow up with you for additional information if we think your project's a good fit and that we want to further evaluate it. Then we're anticipating hopefully releasing a draft restoration plan in the fall of 2025. We would hold a public meeting and have that public comment period in the same time frame, and then hopefully publish a final restoration plan in the spring of 2026. Once that final restoration plan is published, we would begin to implement the restoration plan and the projects that are contained within. And, you know, kind of one thing to note about that is that, you know, this plan will select various projects for funding. The trustees are not going to be the ones implementing these projects, at least they're not in most of the cases, would be the project proponent that proposed them. We typically would give a grant to those projects, to those project proponents, either from MassDEP via the kind of standard Commonwealth contracting process, or we also sometimes go through US Fish and Wildlife Service through some kind of agreement. So that's why we're here. We're really looking for great projects and we really need your help to do that. We want to achieve the best possible restoration outcomes, want to make this money go as far as possible and have the most benefit for those injured natural resources. So we definitely look forward to hearing from you. I'm going to put our contact information up on the screen in case you don't have it. You can certainly feel free to reach out to us anytime with questions. If you want to talk through a project and see if it makes sense to submit for funding, or if you have any questions at all, you can feel free to reach out to Whitney or I and be happy to talk. Additionally, there is some additional information on MassDEP's website that you can look up. And again, that project information sheet will be up there in the next day or two, and we'll be posting a video of this meeting as well as the slides on that website, hopefully by the end of the week. And before I open up for questions, I just wanted to give Whitney a chance to kind of chime in if she has anything I missed or wants to add anything before we open it up.
I think you covered it very well.
Thank you. So that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and be more than happy to take any questions if you want. You can either type it into the chat box or you can raise your hand and unmute and be happy to talk now or any other time. It's got to be someone with a question.
This is Chuck Martinson. I'm the shellfish constable in Falmouth. And a quick question I had was if there is a leverage or match, is that weighted heavier in the decision-making process or not?
That's a great question. So match is not required, but it's definitely something we like to see and we kind of consider as part of the evaluation process. This isn't totally your question, but it brings up something I wanted to say was that the NRD funds also can be used, are really flexible and can be used towards match for other grants. If you want to seek additional funds, they're considered settlement funds. So they can be used as match for both, typically can be used match for both state and federal grants. So we've had them used as match for a lot of grants in the past, kind of to increase the restoration that can be done and leverage additional funds. And additionally, these funds, they're not tied to a fiscal year, they're, can cross multiple fiscal years. Our grant contracts typically extend over, several years, so folks can, get the project from whatever phase it's in through completion. So maybe more information than you were asking for, but yes, we do take match into account, but it's not a requirement of this funding opportunity.
And I just have one follow-up question to that. And that is just a little bit of clarification on the submission. I know that as you said, you're going to be posting in the next day or two, the form.
Mm-hmm.
We have, since this came out, we've been working with our team on a project proposal. And I guess, is it okay to just go ahead and submit that full proposal right off the bat then, or would you like us to wait until we're, to move on from there? How would you like that handled?
I think if you wouldn't mind, it would be great if you could just kind of fill out that project information form. Whitney will send it around in the morning. It's pretty quick, I think, and you could just kind of write a note if you want to attach that other kind of documentation that you're working on. You could just include it as an attachment. But having everyone fill out that same form kind of helps us standardize the evaluation a bit. So that would be really helpful. Anyone else? And again, Whitney will be sending that project information form out first thing in the morning. It'll be posted to MassDEP's website this week. If for some reason you're not on our existing mailing list, feel free to send us an email or stick your info in the chat and we'll make sure you get it. All right, I'm gonna do 1, 2, 3. Call it a night. Any last questions before we sign off? I don't think so. Well, thank you so much for joining us on a cold, what is it, Wednesday night. Definitely appreciate it. Don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. We're happy to talk anytime. So thank you so much. Have a great night.